This segment is brought to you in part by the Canadian Historical Arms Society, owners of the Genesee Range, the premier recreational sport and training facility in Western Canada. See us online at historical-arms.com.
The Quiet Professional, a podcast about law enforcement, security, justice, and politics. We are digging deeper on the issues and going where the information takes us with access to experts and authorities. Welcome to The Quiet Professional. Hey everybody, welcome back to The Quiet Professional. Today we are going to be talking about drugs, damn drugs, and politics. A take on the line of lies, damn lies, and statistics. And I think you can kind of tell where this conversation might be going. For this, I have one of my favorite guests, Michael Brown here. If you haven't heard him on the show, he's been on, I think this will be your third, maybe fourth time. Give you a little background on him. So he is a former DEA Senior Special Agent with 32 years of experience. He spent 20 years working overseas in the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and his last foreign tour was as the DEA Country Attaché for Myanmar, the world's largest producer of illicit methamphetamine. Currently, he's the Global Director of Counter-Narcotics Technology at Rigaku Analytical Devices and host of the podcast, The Opioid Matrix, a journey into the rabbit hole. So welcome, Mike.
Hey, thank you. It's a pleasure to be back on your show.
Man, we were saying just before we fired this up, there's so much going on. Every time you come on the show, I've got like just this massive list of questions that I want to get to. And we don't have enough time to get to everything, but I always enjoy it. You are one of the most insightful people on these topics. So I'm always happy to have you in here. But I do want to start just talking about your podcast. I love promoting this thing. I listen to all of them, but I think you've kind of slowed it down a little bit. You're doing, is it one a month now?
Yeah, we started, a podcast has been going for about 2 years now. We started with doing, 3 to 4 guests a month. So, that's an incredible amount of research and time that has to go into it, kind of as my side gig, the podcast host. So I had to slow it down, excuse me, to one a month in order to fit in with all my travel and my other work as the director of counter-narcotics for Rigaku. So now we're a little more selective on our guests. We're bringing in people that are really, I feel, relevant to either narcotics enforcement, harm reduction, the medical side of addiction, homelessness, and all the other issues surrounding the opioid crisis.
Yeah. It's just with all the stuff going on in the world and how fast things are changing, someone's got to get you paid for this, and we got to get you on there once a week again.
I tell you, pro bono so far, but we'll see how it goes.
I know what you mean with like the research that goes into it, because that's same here. I'm putting them out once a week on average. Sometimes I end up bumping it up to 2, and then it's like I'm reading day and night. But it's my side gig. It's not my day job. So it's tough. It's definitely tough. Awesome. And I'll make sure I put up a link to this in the episode description so people can go check it out. But today we're going to be talking a little bit about Canada. We've been getting called out in the news more and more frequently. Actually, I should say not mainstream news. They have yet to pick up on this, but there are some good sources out there, good reporters that are kind of picking up on this. Maybe we'll start with just talking about some of the attractiveness of Canada as a hub for organized crime. And we'll get into talking about where exactly the fentanyl's coming from, going to, but we'll start with just the attractiveness of Canada.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about why we're seeing this here? It's not a new thing. I think it's newly reported on, but it's been here for decades. So maybe you could kind of take us through it.
The inefficiency of Canadian law enforcement, I think, lies more with the Crown prosecutors as opposed to law enforcement. Now, we can go back. This goes back 3 decades to when the Hells Angels were running methamphetamine production and distribution, along with the outlaw motorcycle gangs. You had the Italian mafia. These are all well-established transnational criminal organizations that have been operating in Canada for more than 3 decades. And that includes the triads from Asia. The Pakistani and Indian trafficking groups are also well established there. to include the Vietnamese. And I think it all comes down to, the inability or the weakness of the Crown prosecutors to effectively prosecute and convict multiple defendants. The RCMP makes the cases, but like in the United States, it's the prosecutor's office who dictate the pace and how things will be prosecuted. And I think recently with these large seizures of narcotics and super labs, that's great, but there's no prosecution. There's no arrest. So it's irrelevant at that point. Criminals just go back into the cycle and start over again.
We've seen some record busts up here, and like you're saying, it gets to a point where law enforcement does all this stuff, spends all the money, all the resources, and then the case gets dropped. And there's not a lot put out up here about why the cases are dropped. Now, I know from behind the scenes and seeing some of this myself, but I think we don't really do a good service of explaining why things do get dropped and what the actual impediments to it are. And explaining that to the public, they just see it as another failure, I guess, on the part of law enforcement, because law enforcement's the front lines of this whole thing. So it seems like, we're the face of it. So we're going to be ones called out for it when there's a lot of people in the process behind the scenes. Law enforcement is one part of the whole justice process. There's a lot going on behind the scenes, and I don't think that gets across to people.
No, let me give you some context to it. I spent 10 years in Pakistan working cases, another 5 years in Southeast Asia, primarily in India. And I can tell you on multiple occasions, I developed cases in Pakistan where working for DEA, we identified tons of heroin and hashish being shipped from Pakistan and India via container to Canada. Now, a lot of that information was developed through confidential sources, which DEA managed. I would pass that information to the DEA office in Ottawa. They would meet with RCMP and say, hey, we've got container X, Y, and Z on its way. In 6 months, there's going to be, maybe 3 to 4 tons of heroin and hashish coming into the port. We'd like to do a controlled delivery, extend the investigation, and identify all the players on your side. Every one of those cases was turned down because they said, we can't work with foreign informants, right? Run by another organization such as DEA. So we would either have to turn the informant over to RCMP or Customs and Border to do their own separate investigation, or simply just dismiss the case. And of course, we're not going to give up our informants to the RCMP or any organization, right? There's a level of protectionism that we have to provide for our case integrity and means and methods of collecting the intelligence. So, the containers would go to Canada, they would seize them at the port, and that'd be the end of the case. Well, at some point, we just stopped sharing the information because we risk burning or damaging our investigations, and the relationship just never developed. So this has been an ongoing problem, in my opinion, with the Canadian government and how they look at prosecuting large-scale drug trafficking organizations.
So is it a largely a policy alignment issue then, whether that's through the Crown's office and the attorneys in the U.S., or even just the way law enforcement handles things, like you're saying, when it comes to informants?
I think it's an overemphasis on the Crown prosecutors to protect the rights of the criminals, right? There are so many rights for drug traffickers and murderers and organized crime in Canada that the preponderance of evidence they put on law enforcement to prove the case far exceeds what we have to do here in the United States to get prosecutions, successful prosecutions. And I think the Canadian government is just so over concerned with violating the rights of these criminal organizations or these individuals in these criminal organizations that it completely ties up their prosecutorial efforts, and they wind up dismissing the case. Because, you can what if a case all day long, but at some level, you have to start prosecuting and convicting these individuals, or these organizations are just going to see Canada as a petri dish for expansion, for mutation. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing now with the expansion of the cartels, Mexican cartels, to Canada, developing it as a secondary hub for the production of fentanyl. and possibly these East Asian organizations also involved in methamphetamine and fentanyl production.
When some of the points you bring up there are really good. I think a lot of the issue that we see up here lies in leadership, or I'll say management and lack of leadership when it comes to some of these Canadian law enforcement agencies, especially on the cooperation side. So I've been in meetings, I've been a part of discussions, I've been a part of projects, and we've seen where, you'll get certain agencies in the room, and obviously the RCMP's our National Police Service, so they're kind of going to take the heat on this one, but they're getting called out now on a more frequent basis for failing to, I'll say, follow through on certain investigations. And it used to be where it was like an annual thing. Maybe you'd hear one thing a year. Then it slowly kind of became a monthly thing. Now, certain reporters, certain journalists are putting stuff out on a weekly basis. And it's almost getting to the point where it's going to be daily. All these things kind of popping up. Hey, you didn't help with this. You didn't do this. But, my experience is I've been in the room where everybody's kind of willing to help, willing to play ball. And then you get certain management in the room who's like, we can't really help, or we don't want to do something. But then you find out later they took information from that meeting and went and ran a parallel investigation. And now are saying, oh, look at us. We got all these kilos, or we busted this and got guns. And it's like, why didn't you share that with us? And then it brings up another point that one of these projects, it was Project Castillo. So this was by the Toronto Police Service. I think one of the things that we're missing up here is media calling some things out, or at least asking the right questions. So this was where the Toronto police, they seized 835 kilos of cocaine. They had a big thank you thing in their press conference. So they said, thank you, RCMP, CBSA, York Regional Police, so a bigger police service up here. And then they named a couple others. They didn't name any U.S. agencies. And then in the same article, they say the collaboration with CBSA and RCMP is important here. We know these drugs traveled all the way from Mexico over the southern U.S. border and here to Canada, where we stopped them. Now, when I heard this, it immediately, the questions that came to mind for me were the Americans aware? Why didn't you tell them? Because now you've allowed it to cross two borders. Were drugs offloaded into the U.S.? Because then you now allowed drugs to go into the U.S. without stopping them. Did you lose any of the loads? Even when they came across into Canada? Like, can you say you had an eye on this the whole time? Like, there's just so many issues. But then they have the giant media photo op and they're celebrating all this stuff. And all I'm thinking is, like, it just justifies all the stuff that I see the American law enforcement agencies complaining about when it comes to sharing of information, trying to get us to do something up here about the issue. So that's just kind of my rant and a few examples of what I've seen. But is that similar to your experiences?
Well, I mean, the open source reporting is clear, and in many of those cases in which you're referring to, DEA, the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, which is partnered with the RCMP, shared a lot of that information. Hey, we've identified large-scale trucking operations moving multi-ton quantities of narcotics from Mexico through California into Canada. We'd like to do a controlled delivery. Let's figure out who the drugs are going to, what's the organization on the Canadian side, and let's make an arrest and prosecution. And of course, the RCMP or the other Canadian authorities say, hey, yeah, that's great information. And then they go silent. Next thing you know, DEA is hearing about a big seizure and no arrest, or arrests and prosecutions that are then declined. And the DEA is like, hey, what happened to the information? Oh, we're not going to share it with you.
Yes.
Or the Canadian authorities have information that a large drug shipment's coming through the United States, and they don't share it because they want to get the seizure for the media press conference. Hey, we made a big seizure. Look at what we're doing to keep Canadians safe, right? And of course, the media, in my opinion, and I see this in the United States, it's a case of hear no evil, see no evil. Some of the media, especially on the left, doesn't want to talk about that, hey, we have a major narcotics problem in this country, and that better and more aggressive mitigation efforts need to be taken. And I think in Canada's case, they don't want to get the impression or have people think that now they're a major drug hub for the cartels. So they downplay it. Oh, there's nothing happening, nothing to see here. Just a few kilograms of fentanyl that we caught at the border. And even the U.S. media said, oh, there's no big problem. It's only 4 kilos.
Yeah.
But they didn't talk about the super lab that could produce 95,000 tablets, 95 million tablets.
Yeah, 95 million.
95 million. And then 30,000 pounds of precursor chemicals. The DEA says, hey, where are those chemicals coming from in China? Oh, we can't tell you. Right? This goes to the heart of the fentanyl supply chain. Precursor chemicals coming from China are now going into Canada through legitimate pharmaceutical or chemical companies and then diverted to massive pharmaceutical grade clandestine laboratories. That's a major problem for North America.
Yeah. And even it's good that you bring up the CBP numbers there, because it's funny when they mention those numbers, it's like that's the ones caught at the normal crossings. I think we call them, if you walk out into the bush and you cross, it's called an irregular crossing. Like, we're so nice up here. But they had about 7,000 drug seizures at the northern border, and that was in 2024. There's approximately 5,500 miles of open border between Canada and the U.S. Do you think the criminals are just driving it across, like just nice and in their vehicles? It's like, no. And I've seen the videos. We know people go out into the bush and they run across. They put on those 72-hour deployment bags, load them up front and back, and carry 2 more, and they go running out. And it's like, we're not talking about that. I think where it gets lost too is when media talks about those numbers, and then Trump goes on the media and says, it's flooding in here. The media just says, well, it's 4 or a few dozen kilos that's been caught. Is it going across as completed fentanyl? Like, if we bust precursors coming in, we wouldn't call that fentanyl, but we know it's being used to make fentanyl. So is there kind of a disconnect in the language that is being used between media or what the politicians are trying to say?
Well, I think they're playing with the numbers, right? When you look at 30,000 tons of precursors, that's for methamphetamine. Methamphetamine requires a lot of precursors, containers of precursors to make it. Fentanyl requires 10 or 12 shoeboxes, right?
Yeah.
When we hear about precursors, whether it's methamphetamine or fentanyl, those are the ingredients, so to speak, needed to make the final product. So when we heard about, only 4 kilograms of fentanyl coming from Canada to the United States, that was in reference to a finished product, right? Fentanyl had been produced from the precursors, and then it was being smuggled into the United States through the official checkpoints. But you make an excellent point. If you got a 5,000-mile border, that's completely open. And the cartels know under the Biden administration that for 4 years, CBP, U.S. Customs and Border Protection personnel were pulled from the northern border and put on the southern border to administer the paperwork for letting in 11 million illegal immigrants. So the cartels had 4 years of establishing Canada as a super secondary hub for the production of fentanyl, methamphetamine, cocaine distribution, because everybody wasn't looking. No one was looking at Canada under the Biden administration. The cartels took advantage of that opportunity to set up, I believe, to increase or improve the drug producing capabilities of Canada in those 4 years to what it is now, because they've seen historically that the Canadians not are incapable, but are unwilling to address the critical issues of prosecution, especially if it involves their minority population.
Yeah. And I know I don't want this to fully sound like we're just bashing Canada. There are good people. I think I want to say the frontline workers definitely do get it. And I find from my experience in current stuff that I'm involved with, that it's a lot of the frontline that are doing a good job. But once you start getting a little bit higher, it literally becomes about politics and not about public safety. And I just find some of the arguments were very disingenuous. When they talk about those numbers being caught at the borders, it's like, well, that's the Americans' problem. It's going down there. But it's like, we're the source of it, though. It's being made here, and it's not just being made for the U.S. Like those, we're distributing it across Canada. We're shipping it to Australia. Kim Bolan, big reporter up here on this stuff, she did a whole expose, like a 5-part series down there in Australia and some of the islands around it, and just about the drug trafficking that's going on. I mean, this stuff is out there, but it's just not. I don't think it's being talked about in a genuine way. Even when we, and I think you mentioned it a bit earlier, like the trucking industry that is tied into all of this. It might only be small amounts being caught going down into the U.S., but it's a lot of Canadians crossing the border, going down with 18-wheelers, picking stuff up, bringing it back to Canada, and we're exchanging drugs. Fentanyl's going down, cocaine and other drugs are coming up. So it's a big cycle, and we're fully involved in it. And yeah, it's just on the Canadian side, we don't seem to get it. It's very difficult.
Let's be clear. We're not saying RCMP, the police officers, the men and women who were out in the street making these cases, we're not saying this is their fault. I've worked in law enforcement for 32 years, and I could not initiate a case unless I went over and briefed the United States Attorney's Office, and they agreed to prosecute it. And I had, if not daily, weekly meetings with the United States Attorney's Office on how the case would go. Excuse me, because they're the ones who are going to prosecute it. That's the end game. So they're really calling the shots. And that's the same in Canada. When it gets to a high level investigation, such as, these massive labs and these trucking investigations, it's the Crown prosecutors who are telling RCMP, this is what you can do, and this is what you can't do. And then when the RCM presents the case, the Crown prosecutors say, oh, well, you don't have enough information, and they dismiss the case. And this goes back to, again, historically, you got to look at the history of Canada. When the Hells Angels had the first biker war with the outlaw motorcycle gangs, right? Canada had allowed both of these gangs to metastasize into major criminal organizations. The first biker war, these groups it was like Iraq. They were blowing up cars, killing each other, gangland, murders, drug trafficking, weapons trafficking. And the Canadians, the prosecutorial office, Crown prosecutors, were unsuccessful, I think, in several attempts to prosecute the leadership of Hell's Angels. He got out, he beat the charges 3 or 4 times because of the incompetency of the prosecutor's office to make the cases and protect the informants. I think 1 or 2 informants were actually murdered in those cases because they leaked that information. So Canada has a very bad history of weak prosecutions, which allow criminal organizations to metastasize to what they are now. And what happens when criminal organizations metastasize? You have Mexico, you have Colombia, you have Afghanistan, you have Myanmar, you have failed states, which are now so entangled in criminal activity that all that criminal money gets mixed into the economy. Now you can't extricate yourself from that situation.
Yeah. I was going to say, like, so much of the money becomes entangled in the good money that basically if you pulled it out of the system, you would collapse.
Right now, everybody says, why isn't President Sheinbaum doing more? Because over the last 3 decades, the Mexican cartels have been allowed to infuse, some of the estimates I heard, is from 30 to $50 billion are circulating through the Mexican economy at any given time. If you were to extricate or pull all the cartels out of Mexico tomorrow, no more drugs. Hey, great success. The entire state would fail, and so would the U.S. trade. The U.S. would, a significant portion of the U.S. economy would collapse overnight, right? So the problem, Canada says, hey, the drugs aren't coming here, but the money's going to Canada. The money's going into the Canadian infrastructure, and it's being infused with legitimate dollars. And at some point, it's going to be so much narco money in the Canadian financial networks that you can't move it, you can't pull it out, because now it's going to affect the overall economy. Nobody's thinking beyond the drug seizure, beyond where the drugs are going, and looking at the economic impact that narco dollars has on an economy.
Yeah. I think our biggest problem up here would be real estate. That would be one of the major things that would collapse. And, so one of the things I wanted to just kind of get your opinion on was talking about the northern border and how you would actually do some enforcement up there. So you think of some of the issues that come along with that. You're talking about weather, distance, low population, tribal lands. So, what would it take to actually enforce along this border? I'm guessing it's more than 2 Black Hawk helicopters.
Dude, let me tell you about what I call the 5 critical capabilities cartels have to function. One, they have to have secure communications, right? Encrypted communications. Why? Second critical cartel is because they need to communicate with their precursor chemical suppliers and the triads in China, India, and in Western Europe. 3, they need transportation. How do we move multiple tons of precursors from China or Europe or Asia to laboratories in clandestine laboratories in Canada? 4, how do we repatriate the money? How do we launder the money from drug distribution?
Mm-hmm.
And 5, the most critical capability for the U.S.-Mexican borders, how do we move finished product from Mexico, from the labs, into the United States? Now, the most efficient way for the cartels to move narcotics from Mexico into the U.S. is concealed in cars and cargo. 95 to 98% of all drugs coming into the United States are smuggled right across the U.S. border. Why? Well, because the 2,300 or 3,000 mile border between California and Texas is very austere. It's very hard to go over the mountains. It's desert, and you've got a wall, and you've got thousands of CBP officers mining it, right? And now, since Trump has been in office, there has been, I think, less than 2 or 3 individuals coming across that border, and almost no drug seizures, no gotaways. Now let's look at Canada. Same critical capabilities apply, but you've got a 5,000 mile border of forest, of woods, no roads, no infrastructure, almost impossible to police. So if the Canadians don't focus on the top 3 critical capabilities, communication, foreign transportation, and the development of clandestine laboratories, if they don't hit those 3 top capabilities, there's nothing you can do. If it makes it to the border, it's going to get across.
Yeah. You know what? I want to say, I think that when you look at the cartel, they're already thinking of ways to not even have to cross the borders. Like when we talk about the money, right? You got all the underground banking systems, and they can do stuff just within their country. So you've already kind of taken one of those elements out. They don't have to necessarily worry so much about law enforcement dealing with their finances. Would that be correct?
Well, exactly. I mean, the Mexican cartels, pretty much every criminal organization in the world is now using the Chinese money laundering system, the mirror system of transferring money. The money never leaves place. So let's say Sinaloa in Canada, they collect $1 million in drug funds. They take it to the Chinese money launderer in Canada. He takes the 3% off the top. And now let's say you've got $800,000 you need to launder. Well, the Chinese money launderer just takes that money and puts it into his accounts in Canada through various front companies, right? Then he calls a broker in China and says, hey, I'm going to have a dozen accounts wire money to my account in China. So that money is then wired from Canada to China, right? And then it goes into those banking accounts. Then those accounts simply wire the money to another account in Mexico to a front company, Raul's Auto Repair. And he's got dozens of front companies that then get that money for ghost shipments, parts, etc. Now the cartels can go in and pull that money, right? Now that's being done, in my opinion, with the cooperation of the CCP and the financial institutions, which are strictly controlled by President Xi and the Communist Party. I think that when you look about the billions, not millions, but billions of narco dollars that are being funneled through the Chinese banking system, the CCP has to be aware.
Yeah.
Right? They have to know, hey, all this money, where's it coming from? Why are we seeing all these remittances go out from Chinese banks to banks in Mexico or to companies in Canada? What's going on, right? So that money, back in the day, you had to put the money in a truck and drive across the border. high risk. I think that's still happening. But now with the Chinese coming in and setting up these international money laundering operations, the money never has to move.
Yeah.
It's like the whole old Huala system. The Huala system, let's say if you're an Afghani and you want to send money to Afghanistan, you don't use the banking system. You just go to an Afghani money broker in Canada. Here's $100. I need to get it to my family in Canada, in Afghanistan. Broker takes 10% or whatever the juice is, 3%, calls a Huala guy in Afghanistan. Hey, give this guy's family $80. That money's then given, but the money to pay the other Huala guy is already in Afghanistan.
Wow.
Right?
It's crazy.
So nothing's ever moving.
Like it's fascinating how this stuff works, and you never hear of this in Canadian media. Like I see most of this reporting coming from the U.S. The Department of Justice will put out their statements of like how they busted people, and they'll put a little bit more out there, like explain a bit of the investigations. I don't see that up here, and I just feel like we are not reporting on it properly, and we're not getting people's attention where it needs to be. And that kind of goes into forcing the politicians, right? Generating that political will to take this stuff seriously.
Well,
so it's kind of a bad cycle.
Was your point? Was it Trudeau?
Yeah.
Yeah, Trudeau had a whole campaign of denial. Yeah. I mean, it was like, I don't want Canada to get the bad rap. We're not a drug trafficking state. We don't support drug trafficking. There's nothing to see here, quote unquote. He was lying to the public. He was lying to everyone in Canada. He was a main impediment to U.S. cooperation because he had very leftist leaning policies in Canada, and that whole playbook is, hey, there's nothing to see here. We don't have a crime problem. You hear that from the mayor and governor of Illinois and Chicago. I think 5 or 6 people were shot over the holiday weekend, Labor Day. 51 people were shot and wounded. But there's no problem here, right? Crime is decreasing. And when people say that to me, I say, well, what's an acceptable number of homicides in your city? Oh, well, in my opinion, crime can never be decreased enough. If it's one homicide, that's one family who lost loved ones, right? That one homicide is too many. Mm-hmm. In D.C., I think in 2024, I think it was 12 or 13 women were murdered. 159 men were murdered, primarily all African Americans. And if you listen to Mayor Bowser, well, that's an acceptable number because she said crime is decreasing and we don't need the National Guard and this surge of federal law enforcement. But if you're the family members who lost one of those 159 young men, that's a problem for you, right?
Well, and if you bring in, and from the outside looking in, I kind of thought of it as, if they're bringing in the National Guard to just say do like sentry duty, just stand on all these corners and make sure no shootings happen, it allows law enforcement the time and to use their resources for the bigger investigations, for those other things, because they're not just scrambling all over the place, going from one shooting to the next. Like, it's resource intensive.
And you hit it on the head. See, the American media does not explain it like that. They explain it as though National Guard is going to be running around, making arrests, making investigations, violating people's rights.
Yeah.
They refuse to report, just as you said it, picture perfect. The National Guard is a force multiplier. You've got National Guard standing in front of a CVS or Walgreens or a Lululemon store. The flash mob's not going to come in and steal thousands of dollars, right? The teenagers running around with handguns aren't going to go shoot somebody where there's National Guard. This allows DEA, FBI, ICE, U.S. Marshal Service, ATF to focus on the high crime areas, to surge into those areas and take out those organized crime elements, which we never talk about. Domestic gangs, the Crips, the Bloods, the Latin Kings, the Black Gangster Disciples, right? No one talks about the domestic organized gangs, which are the ones creating all the homicides, which are the ones selling the narcotics. It's not Sinaloa and the Jalisco New Generation Cartel pulling the triggers on all these homicides.
Yeah. One of the things that I guess we should actually mention as well is, there's these strikes that Trump put out recently, or put the video out for on Tren de Aragua.
Right.
They hit this boat that was transporting some drugs. Maybe I'll get to that in just 1 second. But one of the things that I think is this kind of speaks to is addressing a problem more at the root cause of it. And this is something I've brought up here. It's very hard to change minds in this way, but I always wondered, if Canada has this problem with cartels, with these international organized crime groups, why are we not going and addressing it with partner agencies more at the source? So, do we have Canadians from Canadian intelligence agencies or law enforcement agencies working at the southern U.S. border when we know, like this Project Castillo that I mentioned earlier? If we know stuff's coming across the southern border and it's intended for Canada, why are we waiting till it gets here? Why are we not addressing these issues? Choke it off as close to the source as possible. It seems like a cheaper, we're going to save a lot more resources than waiting till it gets up here and spend millions on surveilling things. And we can have a win-win, right? All these agencies can get together and say we all work together. But I wondered about that. Like, why is Canada not involved in the border discussion down south? Because it has a direct impact on us.
Man, you're way too logical. You just said makes perfect sense. And why it's not happening is anybody's guess. DEA, one reason I think DEA is the premier law enforcement agency in the world is because we have spent years developing these international partnerships. DEA realized a long time ago, coca plant doesn't grow in America. Poppies don't grow in America. Drugs are produced somewhere else and then imported into the United States. So if DEA is going to address those root causes, as you so elegantly mentioned, we have to work with our foreign counterparts in Colombia, Peru, Mexico, Canada, Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
So we can get that intelligence and we can go to the root causes. If China was to work with the United States overnight, they changed their mentality. We're going to work with the U.S. 100% on the root causes to address fentanyl and methamphetamine, because we know it's synthetic and we know 99% of all the precursors to make those drugs are coming from China. China could turn it off tomorrow. They could go to the pharmaceutical industry, to the triads, and say if anybody ships one precursor to anywhere, it's death penalty. China executes on average 300 people a year for having a kilogram of cocaine, but they don't execute anybody shipping precursor chemicals. Ask yourself why, right? So it's the diplomatic bilateral relationships that are this key element to degrading and mitigating international drug trafficking, because the root cause to all narcotics production are precursor chemicals. If you disrupt that supply chain, you make it impossible, or you make it very hard to produce cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and fentanyl. Heroin and cocaine are semi-synthetic, meaning you need the plants. Heroin or methamphetamine, fentanyl, MDMA, ketamine are all 100% synthetic, which means you need what? Massive amounts of precursor chemicals that come from where? China. Mm-hmm. How hard would it be for China to identify who these companies are? As a matter of fact, and a U.S. intelligence report came out that said China, in fact, gives a tax incentive to companies that sell the most precursors to Mexico.
Oh, really?
So is that not willful blindness? It's not even blindness. It's like, hey, we agree with what you're doing. We know drugs are going to America and killing Americans. And guess what? America is our number one strategic enemy. And who's America's number one strategic enemy? It's China, right? Espionage. They steal from America. They steal from the world. They're supplying weapons and intelligence to Ukraine, to Putin. They work with North Korea. So what side are they really on?
Yeah. It definitely, on our side of things, I think we just really got to somehow find a way to get the politics out of it. And, if the public wants to know what the numbers are, or where the problems lie, or where the crime is happening, just go to the law enforcement agencies. And up here, I think in the U.S. they do a bit better job of this, but up here we have had trouble talking to the public from a law enforcement side. It's always very hush and like very closed up. So I think we need to do a better job being at the front of those discussions. If I see a politician on the TV talking about crime, I'm like, they are literally reading a script. Whatever numbers they want to put out, they're putting out. They're saying like, kind of washed statements. So I listen because I do this podcast, but I tend to ignore it for other reasons. So,
we have a saying in America, when you drink the Kool-Aid, it's too late to change, right? You've ever heard that saying?
Yeah.
Especially in sanctuary cities, right? In my opinion, the new problem with narcotics aren't killing Americans. Bad policy is killing Americans. And if you look at sanctuary cities, Colorado, California, the states, New York, Washington, D.C., New Orleans, you have elected officials who are more or less enabling drug addiction and drug usage, right? You have politicians in Chicago now saying, we don't want federal help decreasing the murder rate. So in effect, you're saying the murder rate, which is out of control, is okay, right? And then you have people who are electing these officials like Mandani. He's going to win. He's going to be the next New York mayor, the mayor of New York. He clearly says, I want to defund the police. I want to empty Rikers Island. I want to create more drug use locations. You have this in Canada, I think British Columbia. You have the state has become the drug dealer with hydromorphine for heroin.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily a messaging problem from your leaders, but the people in some of these provinces support progressive harm reduction, decriminalization policies that enable drug use, that enable drug addiction, and that favor the cartels. You have to change in Canada the mentality of people to see drug trafficking as a problem for the country, not just for individual provinces.
Well, and it's like you said earlier, it goes back to protecting the criminals' rights. And that seems to be the thing up here where a lot of the discussions center around dealing with the commodity, not around how do we deal with the people? Because it's the person who picks up the weapon and kills the other one. It's the person who deals the drug that, traffics it and it gets out there and kills people. We just have these very superficial discussions about this commodity or that one when we're not actually addressing, again, back to legislation and policy to deal with the person that's doing it.
You make an excellent point. I mean, if you look at that recent super lab, that was it was basically it was an underground pharmaceutical company producing narcotics. It wasn't even a clandestine lab. They arrested one Indian national.
Yeah.
A Sikh.
So this is the Falkland super lab.
So you've got a super lab, which probably takes 100 people to run. They arrested one Indian national. So was this Indian national part of a larger Indian transnational criminal group that set up this laboratory that had these connectivity to order the chemicals? Where are the other arrests?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, there's no information. So is the prosecutor attempting to protect other Indians from being arrested because they want to protect the immigrant population? I don't know. I have to ask that question because, like Canada, Britain also has the same problem. I mean, there was that recent sex trafficking case where it was like a half a dozen Pakistani men were trafficking in young white British women, raping them and selling them in the sex trade. And the British government just looked the other way for years.
Yeah.
It's so bad now in Britain and Ireland that we're looking at potential race wars between, the white British and Irish civilian population and the immigrant population, which is not being held to the same legal standard.
Yes, I 100% agree. And just kind of going back a little bit, I mentioned Trump had changed, I guess, the posture of the White House. So I want to make sure we get this in before the end as well. So they had this strike on this boat. Can we expect more of this? And, where are we going now? Like, this is quite the change. This is a huge paradigm shift from treating narcotics as a criminal act, right? So you all remember, the war in Afghanistan against Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Every night we were watching, we were watching a drone footage of a bunch of Al-Qaeda guys driving in the mountains, and suddenly they disappear from a Hellfire missile. Same thing in Iraq and in Syria. You have, whatever you think about President Trump, you have to give the president all the points for designating
the top 5 cartels, including Trinidad Agua, as FTOs, foreign terrorist organizations. This allowed the military to actually target and go after terrorist organizations. So this recent video, you have 11 traffickers in a speedboat coming from Venezuela. We know President Maduro is supporting narco trafficking, that he sent TDA to the United States to sell drugs and to commit crimes.
Did they not call him? They basically said he's like not a legitimate leader now, and that he is like the head of a cartel.
The country of Venezuela is a criminal state. There's a $50 million reward. I mean, think about Noriega back in the day. He did the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
They sent the U.S. Rangers in to take Noriega out. You could be looking at that in the future. But here's the thing. If you're Trinidad Agua, if you're any drug trafficking group, and by the way, hundreds of go-fasts leave Venezuela, go through the Caribbean, northern coastline of California to deliver narcotics, including submersibles, right? Those submarines that go along the surface. Hundreds of those things every day are leaving South America. Now, if you just saw a speedboat with your narcotics and your personnel blown up, how many people are going to be willing to get in those boats tomorrow and make that same journey, knowing that there's a drone overhead looking for prey?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Let me say this real quick. With that one mitigation effort, Trump may have systematically, completely broken maritime speedboat trafficking. That is huge.
Well, and it goes back to our earlier conversation about cutting things off at the source. Like, why wait? You're literally watching, 90,000 doses of death come in, and it's like, well, we'll wait till they get here, and then we'll wait till they get on land, and we'll wait till they get to their distribution points. Like, why don't we just get rid of it at the source, and then we save a lot of money and change some minds?
Not at the source, but the 5 critical capabilities, the method of transportation. Trump said, I no longer care about prosecuting these individuals and seizing these drugs. I want to send a message. They're terrorists and we're going to take them out.
Yeah.
Period.
Yeah.
But right there, he just initiated a mitigation strategy that will absolutely cripple, in my opinion, speedboat maritime trafficking, which represents, I don't have the numbers, but it's a significant portion of drugs. Low-level speedboats leaving Venezuela, leaving Colombia at night. Very hard to track, very hard to see. And then they can land anywhere. So trying to catch those drugs once they hit the United States is like whack-a-mole. We're losing that. We're unsuccessful at mitigating that. Now, with the military flying drones over a very small portion of the Caribbean, right? It's not like it's a huge ocean, right? This is very easy to monitor. And it's very easy to see, 600 kilograms on the deck of a speedboat and positively identify that. And I think right now the cartel said, whoa, Sinaloa's thinking maybe they're going to hit us in the mountains of Sinaloa. Maybe they're going to hit us in the drug labs in Colombia. We don't know. We got a wild man in the White House who's pulling the trigger. And that is absolutely huge.
It makes me wonder too, and something that might be lost in the discussion when it comes to Canada, but most of our focus is on land crossings and people running through the bush. Our Coast Guard is like minimal amount of ships, and I don't think they have much of an offensive capability. So are people just sending submersibles up here? Are people sending boats up here? And there's a million other ways you can get stuff into a country, especially if we're talking about fentanyl. You want to send a couple shoe boxes in a plane and just drop it and someone could pick it up. I mean, we have vast amounts of wilderness where the labs are, and now you can just airdrop stuff in, or you can ship it up the coast. We have lots of places on the coast you can do deliveries. So all that's never even been talked about up here.
Well, I think, trying to get a submersible from Venezuela or Colombia to the northern shoreline of Canada would be very, very difficult. I think that they're too small to make that journey. But if you're the drug trafficking groups in Canada, just keep using trucks. Right? I mean, how many trucks cross the U.S. border every day? Thousands of trucks carrying cargo, and Canada's not seizing hardly any of those trucks. So there's really no reason to change.
Yeah.
Again, if they can't go after the chemicals, you're never going to be able to police that border. You're never going to have the capability to do that.
Well, we know on the Canadian side that things come through the Great Lakes, right? We have the St. Lawrence River, so there are there's watercraft coming up here. So, but is it something that maybe we send? It's coming out of the U.S., not necessarily from South America, but it's just there's so many other ways that aren't being talked about, and the trucks. I mean, you're 100% right. We've had information on 18 wheelers bringing stuff over the border, and it used to be, who do we even call? Like, until we actually even got a contact, we'd be getting information. But then we get one contact, and it's like, well, they only got so many resources to stop all these trucks. And we know that it's budgeted into the organized crime groups, into their balance sheet. Like, they're going to go, okay, I'm going to send 10 trucks right now. One of them maybe will make it obvious and it's a gimme. And then they pull it over, and now all your resources are tied up, prosecute or dealing with this truck and all the evidence. Everybody else is just going through.
Well, this is why you need the bilateral relationship, right? Because DEA has, a lot of information, the ability to conduct complex international investigations. All those trucks are moving through the U.S. Those are U.S. transportation networks and cartel members. So that information can be shared, and we could work, or not we, but DEA could work those cases with RCMP, but there's no cooperation.
Yeah.
So RCMP is really saying, we're really not that concerned because we don't want to cooperate with DEA or other state and local government agencies in the United States to really mitigate this problem. Because through that international relationship, you could then begin to target all of the major drug trafficking, transportation, and distribution organizations, and you could begin to mitigate that problem.
Yes.
Right? But they're not doing that. They're not addressing the cancer at stage 1. They're allowing it to metastasize to stage 4 and then say, oh, let's go in and try and do something. But at that point, stage 4, it's too late.
Yeah. It's hopefully somebody gets on this sooner than later. And I think you've presented a lot of good solutions. I think we went through quite a bit there. It's going to take a lot of political will and some serious change to happen here.
The U.S. is divided between sanctuary cities and non-sanctuary cities, and it's a fight. It's a fight. We can't even adjust. We can't even have one national policy on drug trafficking because from state to state, it completely changes.
Mm-hmm.
From Chicago, from Illinois, New York to say Florida or Texas, it's completely different policies. One's pro law enforcement, one's anti law enforcement, right? We saw in Portugal, not Portugal, we saw in Portland and Seattle, the police were told to stand down, don't make any arrests, don't go out and arrest drug users, allow the city to have drug use zones, drug-free zones, where nobody's arrested and you can use narcotics, right? There's this huge misunderstanding within harm reduction in the United States that somehow dangerous drug use can be managed and we'll treat it as a disease. People have no choice. They have to use narcotics, right? I totally reject that premise because it's simply a misdirection that enables greater criminality. And who benefits at the end of the day? The cartels.
Yeah.
Right. So if the U.S. can't get a systematic, unified policy, how can Canada, which is even more progressive as a country than the U.S., going to ever align its policies to effectively mitigate the growing, not even a threat, it's there. You've got it, right? Narcotic production and distribution. Canada is on its way to being a super secondary hub to the world in conjunction with the Mexican cartels.
I think that's a good place to wrap it up. Those are good final words. So last thing, where can people find you and your work? So I mentioned the Opioid Matrix, a journey into the rabbit hole. Where else should they connect?
Sure. I mean, I'm just Google Mike Brown, Opioid Matrix, and you'll see my LinkedIn profile. People reach out if they have any questions or other podcasters or anyone wants to talk to me, have a really in-depth, what we call a journey into the rabbit hole, where we can have these unvarnished conversations such as the one. And I really appreciate your willingness to talk openly about what the real problem is. So many podcasters talk around the issues and don't really get into the significant the significant problems associated with policy, associated with the government and the state and local prosecutors not doing their job. So I commend you on this real talk conversation we've had.
Thanks. It's I'm just we kind of get to the point where it's like, okay, what are we doing here? Like, we got to make some serious change, and we have some good people up here that do want to see change. It's just, we got to get, it's kind of like aligning the stars when you're talking like about hierarchy in these organizations and the politics of it. It's, you got good people kind of spaced out in there, but it's like, we just got to get some people to align, the right ones in the right place for the right reasons. And we try.
Stars align every 100 years. We don't have 100 years.
Yeah, I know. It's a good point. All right.
We got to get this thing going, man, or more people are going to die. So, Hey, again, I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you for having me on the podcast.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for listening in and following along with the discussions. Be sure to click the follow or subscribe button on your respective listening platform. Also, check out the Quiet Professional on X and Instagram under TQP780. And most importantly, please share where you can. Everyone has a part to play in getting these education and information pieces out there, so pass it along. Thanks again.